Americans are independent people. Nearly 200 years ago, our nation was formed because the first Americans would not tolerate foreign control of their lives. Today, we face a challenge to one aspect of our independence that has long been taken for granted: our energy independence. It was not until the Mideast oil embargo in the fall of 1973 that most Americans began to recognize the vital role that energy plays in our lives, and that we could not look to domestic energy supplies to fill all of our needs. Gasoline stations ran dry. Airlines cut back flight schedules. Factories were forced to close. Public reaction was practical and positive. Lights were dimmed. Thermostats were lowered. Carpools were formed. People took the bus. Then they talked about it. Out of the initial confusion and anger, a sense of national purpose and direction began to emerge. Programs for allocating available petroleum supplies were enacted. Conservation measures were widely adopted, and the President called for a national effort to restore our energy independence. And then, with the coming of spring, the embargo was lifted. The sense of foreboding and the rising spirit of national unity which had emerged to counter it both seemed, in many instances, to disappear along with the lines at the filling stations.
Fill it up for you, sir.
Public apprehension and public determination were in some cases replaced with skepticism and disbelief. The energy crisis, if there had ever really been one, seemed to be over. Still, as things did seem to be getting back to normal, there were now nagging questions. What was the energy problem all about? Is it really over? Will it happen again? Is America, the richest country in the world, really dependent on the goodwill of foreign governments for such a basic ingredient of our economy? To chart a course through the cross currents of varying points of view and opinion, all must understand the fundamental facts about where our energy comes from, how we use it, and how efficient these uses are. The purpose of this film is to provide some of that basic understanding. To approach the subject more easily, we should have a common unit for all the forms of energy that we use. The largest source of energy for the U.S. is oil. A barrel of crude oil, 42 gallons, has a certain quantity of thermal energy locked in it. This energy is equivalent to the energy we get by burning instead about 6,000 cubic feet of natural gas, or approximately a quarter ton of coal. How much energy is there in a barrel of oil? How much work will it do? It's enough to heat the average American home to 68 degrees through 4.5 days of freezing weather. The energy contained in 10 barrels of oil is enough to move the family sedan from New York to Los Angeles and back. 100 barrels of oil will take a loaded jetliner from Washington, D.C. to Chicago. 1,000 barrels will run the whole city of Baltimore for 10 minutes. 1 million barrels of oil will supply all the energy requirements of the state of California for about 8 hours. To supply our entire national energy needs, America uses millions of barrels of oil equivalent energy each day. Since we will be talking about the energy situation on a national level, we will use this unit, 1 million barrels of oil equivalent energy per day, throughout our discussions. In 1900, Americans were consuming about 4 million barrels of oil equivalent energy per day. By 1950, at mid-century, the United States was using 16 million barrels of oil equivalent energy every day. By the year 1960, that had grown to 21 million barrels daily. This is a flow chart of the U.S. energy economy in that year. The types of primary energy are shown at the left. The size of each line is proportional to the amount of energy which it contains, so we can see at a glance the relative importance of different energy sources and types of use. The largest source in blue represents the energy obtained from oil. The magenta band represents coal, expressed as oil equivalent energy. The orange band represents oil equivalent energy derived from natural gas. The yellow band is hydroelectric power, and perhaps it seems surprisingly narrow to some of you. The total amount of oil used in the United States in the year 1960 was 9.7 million barrels per day, with 80% of it produced domestically and 20% imported, primarily from our Western Hemisphere neighbors in Canada and Venezuela. Let's trace this oil through the economy and along the way learn how energy is used. In 1960, we converted a small percentage of our oil into another form, electrical energy. Some oil was exported. But most of our oil supply was consumed in four basic energy-using sectors of the economy. Let's take a look at these sectors. In the residential and commercial sector, energy is used to heat and light our homes, stores, and public buildings. In the industrial sector, it is used in plants and factories to produce the goods we consume. The third sector is a non-energy sector, representing the use of primary energy sources as feedstocks in the production of synthetic materials, such as plastics and pharmaceutical goods. The large fourth sector is transportation, the energy used to move people and products about the country. In 1960, 2 million barrels per day of oil were used in the residential and commercial sector. 1.3 million barrels in the industrial sector. 800,000 barrels, a very significant amount, were converted to synthetics. But by far the largest use, 5 million barrels per day, was in transportation. In 1960, the coal mines of the United States produced 5.3 million barrels per day of oil equivalent energy. 2 million barrels per day were converted into electrical energy. 500,000 were exported. Coal was consumed in all the end-use sectors. 500,000 barrels a day in the residential and commercial sector, where there were still a few coal-burning furnaces around. Industry was the largest user of coal, 2.3 million barrels. 100,000 barrels a day of coal went to non-energy uses, and approximately the same amount to the transportation sector, where coal-burning locomotives were still in use. Natural gas production had grown dramatically in the 1950s. By 1960, it had replaced coal as the second most used source of energy, almost 6 million barrels per day. Less than 1 million barrels per day were applied to electrical generation. 2 million barrels were used in the residential and commercial sector, where natural gas had rapidly become a favorite fuel. Even more, almost 3 million barrels of natural gas energy were used in industry. Small amounts of gas went into non-energy and transportation uses. The power of falling water produced 300,000 barrels of oil equivalent energy per day in 1960. This was used to generate electrical power. Apart from hydroelectric sources, electric power generation used 3.1 million barrels per day of oil equivalent energy. Of this, 2.3 million barrels were consumed in the process of generation and in transmission of electricity. Over 1 million barrels per day equivalent was available for useful work in the residential, commercial, and industrial sectors. In all of our activities, in the home, at the factory, and on the road, we convert the heat content of our energy sources into light, heat, or some form of motion. In this conversion process, some energy is rejected or lost, while the remainder is actually converted to useful work. In 1960, we used productively the equivalent of 9,600,000 barrels of oil per day, while 9,900,000 barrels per day were rejected as some form of heat loss during the conversion process. On a national basis, we rejected just over 50% of the energy we used. During the 1960s, America's appetite for energy grew at an accelerating rate. By 1970, we were consuming over 32 million barrels per day of oil equivalent energy, compared to 21 million barrels per day just 10 years before. This is an annual growth rate of nearly 5%, contrasted with approximately 3% during the 50s. Oil provided nearly 14 million barrels per day, and of this, 3.5 million barrels per day, an amount roughly equal to the total production of Texas, was coming from outside the country. This compares with less than 2 million barrels per day imported in 1960, less than 1 million in 1950. By By 1970, the days of exporting significant quantities of oil were over. The use of oil had increased everywhere in 10 years. In electrical generation, it had tripled. In homes, stores, offices, factories, and farms, up. As a feedstock for non-energy uses, doubled. In transportation, a 50% increase. Though coal production had increased to 7.5 million barrels per day equivalent, its percentage share of the booming energy market continued to decline. In 1970, we exported about 1/8 of our coal. The domestic use of coal was primarily for the generation of electric power and for industrial activities, principally the steel industry. Natural gas continued its phenomenal growth rate, and in 1970 provided 10.7 million barrels per day equivalent. Gas burned to make electricity had more than doubled from 10 years previous, and its use in homes and industry also increased dramatically. For the first time in 1970, small amounts of electricity were generated by geothermal and nuclear means, two new energy sources with great promise for the electricity-demanding future. Power generation overall had more than doubled from 1960 to 1970. Overall, the amount of energy used in 1970 increased significantly over the decade, as did the amount lost. Actually, our energy efficiency increased slightly to just over 50%. Let's sum up what's happened. Between 1950 and 1970, we saw dramatic growth in the volumes of energy provided by oil and natural gas, two fossil fuels of which we possess large but dwindling reserves. Coal, though it is our most abundant domestic resource, has not been used to keep pace with rising demands. We saw a rapid increase in demand for electric power as industry and consumers alike expressed their preference for more of this clean and convenient form of energy. Perhaps most important, we saw the dependence of the nation on oil imports increase from a net of approximately 500,000 barrels per day in 1950 to 3.5 million barrels per day in 1970. In this 20-year period, the total energy demands of our growing population, our vigorously expanding economy, and our increasing standard of living doubled. Yet during the 60s, there was little talk of an energy crisis. In fact, when normal supply channels were disrupted during 1967 as a result of conflict in the Middle East, America met its own energy needs and supplied significant quantities of oil to Western Europe. What happened in the first few years of the 1970s to bring about our recent difficulties? How did we lose our energy independence? Total demand for energy continued to grow at a rapid pace. In 1973, demand grew by 4.8% to reach over 36 million barrels of oil equivalent energy per day. Our growing concern for the environment led us to shift many coal-burning facilities to oil or natural gas. This increased pressure on our already strained domestic sources of these fuels. During the 1960s, natural gas was our fastest-growing energy source, filling nearly 1/2 of the increase in our demand. But it could not continue this rate of growth. During the first 3 years of the 1970s, natural gas production grew only 1.5% per year. Many industrial users of gas began to face long periods of supply curtailment. A rush began to fill these periods of need with alternate fuels. In most cases, the only alternative was oil, but here too there were problems. Until the early 70s, America possessed an oil-producing capacity in excess of our needs. This was the foundation of our energy independence. We imported oil, but as a matter of choice, not necessity. When our demands at last outstripped our capacity to meet them from domestic sources, there remained only one way to meet them, to import, and that's what we did. By the end of '73, our oil imports were approaching 7 million barrels per day, nearly double the average for 1970. And these increased imports could not be provided from Canadian or other Western Hemisphere sources. There was only one place to find these supplies, the Eastern Hemisphere, and primarily the Middle East. events of late 1973 and early 1974 made it clear that continuing growth in dependence on these imports is dangerous to the national interest. So here we are, facing our energy problem with one shocking experience already behind us. Certainly it's time to look ahead. First, let's put the situation in perspective by examining where we were going. Looking at growth from 1960 on in the familiar terms of our energy economy flowchart may make it easier to appreciate the enormous consequences of continuing to use energy the way we have during the past few years. Projecting energy demand according to our recent patterns of energy use moves us from actual 1973 consumption of about 36 million barrels per day to 60 million in 1985 and 95 million in the year 2000. This projection typifies those made by a number of professional organizations and is almost identical with that for 1985 used by the National Academy of Engineering in a recent report. It is not a forecast. It is a depiction of where we are going if our appetite for more and more energy continues to grow as it has in the past. The recent oil embargo, together with large increases in the cost of energy, will undoubtedly reduce the growth rate shown. But how much? In order to illustrate the dimensions of our future energy problems vividly but fairly, we're going to look at the total energy barrel in the year 2000 and make a series of assumptions about it. First, we can assume that the size of the 95 million projection can be reduced by improving the efficiency of some of our energy-using systems. Assume that we double the miles per gallon for all passenger cars by the year 2000. This would save about 5 million barrels per day. Assume a 10 to 15% improvement in the efficiency of energy used by industry, an ambitious target in view of the historically high technical efficiency in that use sector. This improvement would save about 4 million barrels per day. In the residential commercial sector, if we upgrade insulation requirements, improve building design, and refit many of our existing buildings, we could reduce space heating requirements by at least 10%, and thus lower total demand by another 2 million barrels per day. If all of these actions are taken, there would be a total reduction of about 11 million barrels per day in our projected energy demand for the year 2000. These actions do not exhaust our conservation possibilities, but they would require a considerable commitment to energy conservation. Taken together, they would reduce the size of the energy barrel to 84 million barrels per day. Now, we've got to fill the barrel. First, let's consider the level that imports might be allowed to reach without incurring an unacceptable risk to national security. In 1973, we were importing a little over 15% of our total energy needs. During the embargo, about 1/2 of this supply was cut off. While it is impossible to predict the future, we must recognize that increasing the share of our energy budget supplied by imports would be very dangerous. For our scenario, let's presume that we allow the volume of imports to increase, but hold the percentage of imports in our total consumption to about 15%. If we do so, by the year 2000, we could accept a total import dependency of approximately 12 million barrels per day. This would reduce the portion of the year 2000 barrel that must be filled from domestic energy sources to 72 million barrels per day. How can we fill this energy barrel, which is roughly double our total current domestic energy consumption? What are the possible sources? Let's begin with the fossil fuels. Current oil production from the lower 48 states is approximately 9 million barrels per day and declining. Let's assume that this can be increased to 12 million barrels per day by the end of the century. This would require vigorous exploration and development of both the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and the Gulf of Mexico, and takes into account the keen incentive of higher prices on presently dwindling production levels in our land-based oil fields. Let's also assume that Alaskan oil production will reach 5 million barrels per day. This would require completion of the Trans-Alaskan pipeline and the building of an even larger line within a few years. With existing technology, we could get perhaps 3 million barrels of oil per day from shale. To do so, however, would involve using a significant part of the area's water resources. Let's assume that coal production rises to 17 million barrels per day, equaling oil. To get this much coal, however, means tripling the amount obtained from strip mining and getting a 50% increase from underground mining. Such an effort obviously would place tremendous burdens on other industries, such as steel and transportation, and on our total capital, engineering, and labor resources. Taken together, coal and shale oil production at these levels would require the surface mining of over 100,000 acres each year. Natural gas production has peaked, and most projections indicate a continuing decline over the next 25 years. Let's assume that we can limit this decline, and by the year 2000, provide 7 million barrels per day of our needs from this source. The sum of these projections for our basic fossil fuels comes to 44 million barrels per day in the year 2000. To this, we can now add contributions from non-fossil fuel and new technology sources. Power from hydroelectric plants could be more than doubled to 1 million barrels per day. But to get this, we would, of course, also have to more than double the number of dams we've built up to now in the United States. Many of them would have to be in areas of great scenic beauty, if we're willing to make that choice. We could also add about 3 million barrels per day from two new energy sources, the sun and earth. Solar and geothermal energy could provide electrical power equivalent to more than 200 Hoover dams. Our projection of the growth of these environmentally attractive energy sources is, of course, uncertain. A significant effort to accelerate their development could enhance their contribution, perhaps even doubling the amount. The tasks that we have so far outlined are of massive proportions. They involve enormous cost. They will present us with agonizing choices to make in the years to come. Obviously, they pose great environmental challenges. And we still have 24 million barrels a day to go if we expect to fill the barrel. Nuclear power is the only major source left to consider in this time frame that could possibly be used to fill the remaining part of the barrel. By the end of 1973, over 175,000 barrels per day of oil equivalent energy was produced from 39 nuclear plants. The largest plant operating had 1,000 megawatt capacity. To fill the year 2000 barrel, we would need about 1 million megawatts capacity. Presently, it takes 8 or 10 years to bring a nuclear power plant online. Filling our year 2000 barrel with nuclear power would mean completing the equivalent of a 1,000 megawatt plant at a cost of about $500 million in today's money every 10 days from 1975 through the turn of the century. Can we do that? And the oil shale operations, too, and the offshore drilling, the strip mining, the dam building, the pipelines? Will we have the capital, the raw materials, the engineers, the labor? The answer to those questions is not clear. The scenario we have posed is not the only possible one, of course, but it does outline the magnitude of the challenge we face. We may be able to produce some more oil or gas. We may be able to mine more coal or generate significantly more energy from solar, geothermal, or nuclear sources. But we cannot do so with today's technology at today's prices in an environmentally acceptable way. And so we come back again to finding new and better methods of reducing our rate of growth of energy demand in ways that will not adversely affect the growth of our industry and the standard of living of our people. Meeting the energy challenge of the 1970s and the 80s and the 90s cannot be done by a business-as-usual approach to either the production or the conservation of our energy resources. We will need to draw upon our best scientific, technical, and managerial talent to develop both new ways of producing energy and new ways of using it. Only by understanding the connection between energy conservation and energy production, only by realizing that an additional barrel saved is equivalent to an additional barrel produced, can we maintain our lifestyles and regain our energy independence. We have all enjoyed the benefits of abundant energy. We are all the cause of the energy problem, and we all must help solve it. If we adopt a national energy conservation ethic and each American makes his contribution to it, we can reduce the size of the energy barrel we will need still further. We don't really know how much, but we do know that we can all help. We do know that every gallon, every kilowatt we save means less land torn up, less demand on capital and labor, less pressure on fuel prices, less oil imported. We do know that energy conservation is vital to our energy independence. Make the connection. Save energy. Keep America working.